Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to blackdoctor.org. I'm Shamika Rhymes. I'm your host for this evening for Seeing Eye to Eye. It's where we celebrate eye health. Let me know where you guys are from, where you're watching from. Drop that in the comments. And tonight we're going to be talking about inherited retinal diseases. And from what I've read and heard in the past, aside from eye trauma or unforeseen accidents or acute illnesses, genetics are the leading cause of eye disease. So we're going to get to the bottom of that tonight. Again, if you guys have any questions, drop them in the chat, and then we'll get to them throughout the show. So let me introduce today's guest. I have Dr. Naturio Kauser. He received his undergraduate degree in biochemistry from the University of Virginia and completed his medical education and internship in internal medicine at Virginia Commonwealth University School of Medicine. He completed his ophthalmology residency at Howard University. Are you going to throw us a HU? You got to do it.
Of course, it's interesting because I was born in Hampton, Virginia, but then I did my residency at Howard University. So I'm torn between the HUs.
I gotcha. And you are also the primary author and sole editor for the textbook Ophthalmic Genetic Diseases, a quick reference guide to the eye and external ocular, I don't even know that word right there, abnormalities, first edition. You have you've got an amazing resume. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're also one of the only few individuals currently board certified by both the American Board of Ophthalmology and the American Board of Medical Genetics and Genomics. And you're also an associate professor of ophthalmology, pediatrics, and human and molecular genetics in Richmond, Virginia. Our next guest is Cameron Washington. He is a board certified genetic counselor with the Greenwood Genetics Center in Greenville, South Carolina, where he provides genetic counseling services to patients of all ages. And he's passionate about human and medical genetics. He's a member of the Minority Genetics Professionals Network and Neurogenetics Special Interest Group. Welcome, Cameron.
Thank you for having me.
So we're just going to jump right in, talking about inherited retinal diseases. Cameron, can you tell us what genetics, what does that mean?
Yeah, I feel like when most people hear about genetics, they think about, oh, this runs in my family, or, oh, that might be hereditary. I think a lot of people would rather inherit money, but most of the time we inherit genes. So when we talk about genes and when we talk about DNA, we can't see them. They actually live under the skin and are found inside of each and every single one of our cells. So skin cells, heart cells, brain cells, muscle cells. And that information inside of those cells is essentially a code or a set of instructions. Most of the time it codes for things like proteins, but it can also code for things like traits, eye color, hair color, height, for example. And changes in certain genes can actually cause health problems or health issues for people. So we'll talk a lot today about how certain genes can impact the eye and how it develops and how it forms, and then also how that can sometimes impact vision when a gene doesn't work properly.
Thank you for that explanation. Because I'm one of the ones that wish I would have inherited some money. Dr. Kauser, genetics, like Cameron just explained, involves all the organs. Can you tell us how it relates to the eyes?
Yes, absolutely. So our bodies are made up of trillions of cells. Trillions is a big number, from head to toe. The majority of these cells have 23 pairs of chromosomes. On these chromosomes are approximately 20,000 genes. Each individual gene has instructions to make a protein, often more than one protein. The proteins carry out the jobs in our body. For example, there are proteins that determine how well you all are hearing me right now. Those proteins that determine how well our heart beats. That deep breath in and out, those are proteins working. And also proteins that help with the structure of the eye. They have to be working in order for you to see. And the retina, which is a structure inside the eye, is an important structure. When you view an object, for example, you view a soccer ball, the light rays from that ball enter the eye through the front part of the eye called the cornea. It goes through the lens, which is inside the eye, through the transparent jelly-like material called the vitreous. Then the light rays end up on the retina, which is a light-sensitive tissue that converts these light rays into signals to the optic nerve, to the brain, so we can see that soccer ball. If there's a problem within the genes, that could mean that a protein in the body is not doing its job, and that could have implications for how well we see.
Okay, so why would people think that they have a genetic eye disease? And what kind of signs and symptoms would they experience? And I just thought of an example like, am I going to have cataracts because my parents had cataracts? Both parents. And that's for you, Dr. Kauser.
That's a great question. And I typically tell patients and families there's 7 things you want to look for, as well as providers as well, that are looking for these patients that could potentially have a genetic eye condition. 1, if your vision is deteriorating or declining and you can't correct with glasses or contact lenses, that could be a red flag. 2, if there's a problem with your peripheral vision. So your peripheral vision, if I'm looking straight ahead, the periphery is what you see outside of your central vision. If there's a problem with that, that could also be a clue that it could be an underlying genetic problem. Color vision, if there's a problem with your colors, and particularly if it wasn't since birth, but something that's progressive, you used to be able to see colors and you can't anymore, that could be a problem as well. Also, if you have a problem with bright lights, the problems in daytime lights, that you're extremely sensitive to lights, things like that, that could be a problem. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, if you have a problem at night, if you have difficulty driving at night where you once were able to, or if you have a problem if you enter a movie theater and you don't get there before they turn out the lights, and you get there and the lights are off and you cannot make it to your seat, or if you're in your home and you turn off the light, you can't make it to your bed. All those things could be a problem with your nighttime vision, which could also indicate there could be an underlying genetic eye condition. Also, eye movements. If there's a problem with your eyes, your eyes are supposed to be able to maintain a target and fixate. If there's in particular abnormal eye movement called nystagmus or rapid eye shaking, that could be indication that could be an underlying genetic eye condition. And then the last thing is something that me and Cameron ask every patient and family that comes to our office: what is a family history? If there's a family history of if mom, grandma, brother, sister, aunt, cousin, uncle, and if somebody had either a known genetic eye disease, or if there was some suspicious reason why somebody lost vision and they're not able to explain that, that as well could be a clue. So if you have one in particular or more of those 7 things, then you could potentially have an underlying genetic eye condition.
Thank you. Mr. Washington, genetic counseling is a relatively new specialty. So can you kind of walk us through what a typical day looks like in the life of a geneticist?
Yeah, for sure. You're right. Genetic counseling didn't start really getting off until about the 1970s or so. So, I mean, we've only got about 50 years of, fully practicing genetic counselors. But oftentimes genetic counselors that work in the clinic will either be in some sort of doctor's office, hospital, and nowadays you can actually see a genetic counselor on your phone, tablet or computer. Most of the times when you meet with a genetic counselor, we're not going to be working on nights and weekends. We're going to be working Monday through Friday. And sometimes we're really, as we've talked about, going to be speaking directly with patients. So we're gathering that history, like Dr. Kauser mentioned, really helping people make sense of why they were referred or they see a genetic counselor in the first place. As you mentioned, many people don't know what we do. So a large part of the appointment is actually spent explaining what we do and how we can be of value or of service to the patients that we see. But when we're not doing that, we're actually doing a lot of other things. We wear a lot of different hats. So we're doing research, we're on the phone with laboratories, we're writing letters to families, we are writing letters to insurance companies advocating for testing. And then we're also doing a lot of mentor vision and supervising for the next generation as well. So a lot goes on.
Okay. What about you, Dr. Kauser? What kind of patients do you see? Can you walk us through a typical day, coming into your office?
Yeah, sure. So my patients come from far and wide. Many of these genetic eye conditions or these inherited retinal diseases, they're quite rare. Now, collectively, when you start adding them up, then it does total a significant number, and is actually a significant cause of visual impairment in children as well as adults. Just to put some things in perspective, one of the more common, and I would put common in quotations because there is still quite rare, but one of the more common conditions, for example, is called retinitis pigmentosa. It affects in about 1 in 4,500 individuals. So if you calculate that out based on the US population, there are probably less than 100,000 individuals that have this condition. in comparison to something very common like dry eye disease, where there's about 20 million individuals in the US that have that. And so because of this rarity, the patients often travel to come see me. I've had patients cross state lines, get on a plane to come see me.
Wow.
And obviously we take care of the patients and families within the city as well, but sometimes they do have to travel wide to come see me. I work alongside a genetic counselor, just like Cameron. We work together with these patients, and we take our time. These visits are they're not quick, and they're designed to be that way because we take our time. For example, the patient may come and first see an ophthalmic technician, so they may get their vitals with their eyes. What is their vision on the eye chart? What is their color vision? What is their peripheral vision? Some of those things I mentioned that we're looking for those red flags. And we may dilate the eyes. So we put special drops in the eyes to dilate the pupils. The pupil is the structure inside the eye so we can see to the retina, as I mentioned before, that particular structure inside the eye. And then after the eye technician does their part, then they typically see the genetic counselor. So they see Cameron. And Cameron does his thing, just like he mentioned, talks with the families, get a detailed pedigree or family history, medical history, and can go over the vision in detail, about next steps, and then I would see the patient as well, and I would do both an eye exam, and then for my genetics, ask some additional questions as well. And then between Cameron and I, or whoever the genetic counselor work with me, and ophthalmic technician, we put all our thinking caps on, and we talk about what is the next best step. Often it involves diagnostic testing that we do right there in the office. This could be things like, for example, a visual field test, which is a specialized test that tests your peripheral vision. It could be something called an ERG, or electroretinogram, where we're looking to see how well that the cells inside the retina is responding to bright lights and dim lights. Again, kind of going back to some of those points that you want to look for where patients may be having problems, and then several others as well. And so in totality, in combination with often being dilated and talking with meeting with 3 individuals, and then based on all that, we may figure out, like Cameron mentioned, is it warranted to do genetic testing? And I typically tell families that there's 3 main reasons to do genetic testing. And the first is to really get an answer for what their condition is. Why are they really coming to see me? There's on average over a decade from the time that a patient has visual symptoms, so the very first time they have a visual symptom, until the time they reach a diagnosis is over a decade. So
Wow.
that's about 10 years plus. And we actually did an internal study in Richmond. We looked at our patient population, and we looked at the first 100 patients that we saw in the clinic. And we looked at that very thing. We looked at the time that their vision problem started, time they reached a diagnosis. And actually our average was 15 years, and based on the patient population that we saw. And that's just way too long. I mean, based on the technology and the genetic testing landscape in 2024. And so, a large part of what I do in terms of advocacy and things is to really try to educate others, just like we're having this particular webinar here, is to have providers and be looking for those 7 things that I mentioned. Because often what happens is these patients and families, they go to provider, they have test after test, and they're just unable to get an answer, because it might have been, not always, but it might have been that the right test wasn't being done and they didn't see the right person. And that's unfortunate. I mean, it's a lot. In addition to the financial burden on patients and families, it's a big emotional burden. A lot of these patients they're losing vision, they're going blind, and they want to answer. And so that's the number one reason why I typically tell patients or families that to pursue genetic testing. The second reason is to figure out how this may or may not be running in the family. We're in genetics. The family history is key, as both Cameron and I have mentioned. And it's important for the family to know, and particularly when we're dealing with a child, for example, that's having vision problems, for the family to know, what are their chances that this could reoccur again in the family. And, we never want to steer patients or families in one different direction or not, but we want them to be informed. That's our goal.
Mhm.
And the genetic testing can help with that. It can help determine if there's next to, very little chance that if, for example, a family were to have another child, that they would be affected, or it could be a very high significant chance. And so the genetic testing can give those answers. And the third reason is the clinical trial / treatment landscape.
Mhm.
I've been practicing long enough where this has really changed. I mean, years ago, we really couldn't even say treatment in terms when we were talking about genetic eye conditions. But now there are. For example, in 2017, there was the first gene therapy for an inherited retinal condition came out. And in order to receive this treatment, you have to have a molecular diagnosis first, meaning you have to have a positive genetic test.
Mhm.
And so if you don't have that test, then you wouldn't know that you have the condition, meaning that you wouldn't be able to get the treatment. And it is often that a lot of conditions, there may not be a lot of slam dunks in terms of the treatment landscape, but certainly there are tons of clinical trials. And even if we don't have a treatment or a clinical trial that I can send a patient or family to, it's still important in my first 2 points and knowing what you have, which was my point number one,
Mhm.
and number two, figuring out how this runs in the family.
So for those that may just be tuning in, first, you guys can drop your questions in the comments and we'll get to those. But second, when you say genetic testing, is that a blood test? Is that, this is going to sound real ignorant, but is it something like you just swab the eye or something? Like, how does that work? And is it something that you have to look at, bring in all your family members so you can see if there's some kind of link there? Dr. Kauser, what does that look like? What does genetic testing look like?
Yeah, so and I was gonna let Cameron take that too, because
Okay.
yeah, but I mean, either one. Cameron, do you want to take that, or I feel like I've been talking.
Yeah, no, I love that response because those are the questions that we get every day. So, if there are questions like this in their chatter that you have, Shamika, please ask them because
Okay.
I mean, these are the things that we're trained to kind of address and talk about too. But oftentimes it is a blood sample. Nowadays, because of COVID, we've been able to do some testing off the saliva, which has been really great because we can just sometimes send kits directly to families' homes and they can swab the inside of their cheek, or even for children that may not want a blood draw, or some adults that don't want a blood draw either. But no, oftentimes, I mean, we don't necessarily on that first visit need other family members. On the back end, if we do get some sort of result that we think is an answer, that we think explains what's going on, it certainly can be helpful to rope in other family members to better make sense of what was identified, but more importantly, to make sure that we can inform their health too. Some of these conditions, if they are inherited from a parent or another family member, could have implications for them. So we like to bring them sometimes back in on the back end, but no hair samples, no eye swabs, no fingernails or anything like that from DNA, but usually blood or saliva.
So I have a complicated question for you just to add to that, because I was just thinking about if someone is adopted and they don't know who their family is, they or maybe they don't even know that they're adopted, but then what? If they need genetic testing, but they don't know who to call or say, hey, do you have this too? What do you guys do in that case?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you mentioned that. We see people who are adopted all the time. And if anybody on this call who is adopted, family health history can be a very, very sensitive topic from the beginning of the demographic form all the way up to even being asked that question again. So I want to acknowledge, upfront that is a real thing that happens. But for the most part, we will take what we can get essentially with a family health history or with a medical health history. If you do indeed have a genetic condition or a change in a gene that we think is causing your health issue, the genetic testing will typically pick it up. If you have a genetic mutation or a genetic change, the testing from your DNA sample should be able to identify the change. One of the main limitations that we can sometimes run into is being able to make sense of that finding once it comes back. We often won't be able to give you answers about if that finding was inherited. We often, if it's an inconclusive result, might have our limited options to be able to resolve that inconclusive result. But by and large, I wouldn't want anybody on this call who is adopted or doesn't know very much about their family health history to stop them from seeing a geneticist or a genetic counselor, because we can essentially just work with what we have.
Okay,
And
thank you.
And this is highly specialized testing. So that sample that Cameron's talking about, we collect that in the office, but often we're sending that to very specialized labs. There may be, for certain conditions, a few. When I say a few, I mean 2, 3, sometimes even one lab in the whole country that does this testing. And so often it may take weeks to months to get a result back. And there are different strategies to the testing. I mean, sometimes we can do very focalized testing based on all those things that Cameron and I mentioned happens in the visit, where we try to utilize all those things to narrow down what we think the patient may have. But sometimes we just don't quite, we're not able to narrow it down. So we have to go more of a broad-based testing. So again, sometimes we can narrow it down, and we may test for one gene, for example. And then other times we may need to test all 20,000 genes. And then sometimes we may need to go even bigger than that and test the DNA components in between the genes. And so it really just depends. And so we always tell patients and families that you're not going to get a result back right away, but it can take weeks to months. But as soon as we get a result back, we let the family know. And then also that may trigger a very detailed phone conversations that's also followed by, in particular with a positive result, actually bringing the patient and family back in for us to have a face-to-face visit again to determine what our next best steps is. So Cameron and I really get to know these patients and families well. And it's not often just a one-time visit. It may involve that follow-up visit and then additional follow-ups after that.
Right. So it sounds like you guys are putting together puzzle pieces. It sounds very complicated. But once, like you said, once those results are back, then you meet with the family. And let's just say, like you said, it is positive. But what should the family expect coming back into the office after you call and say, we got your results? What should they expect to hear from you? Like, walking into the office and you have the results. Do you, at that point, lay out a plan that you guys are going to work on to help with whatever the disease is, or is surgery involved? How does that work? Dr. Kauser.
That's a great question. And I think the important part of that for patients and families to understand is that we're working hard even before you step in the clinic visit. We're doing research on that test, in terms of, what was the result. We're looking at it. We might be pulling up different literature reports on how other patients with that particular genetic test did. We may be looking at different textbooks. We may be looking at different clinical trials that are available to the family, different treatment options. My team often puts together a PowerPoint presentation that goes over a visual representation of what that means. And that's something that we go over in the office, we print it out, the family can keep. And again, every case is unique. I mean, often, as I mentioned, there may not be anything from a treatment or clinical trial landscape, but sometimes it is. And sometimes there may be more than one clinical trial. There are certain conditions, we may have 8 or 10 different clinical trials. And what we do is, again, we don't try to direct or point our fingers and tell patients and families, you need to do this, but we try to give them informed information, keep them informed, and then give our assessment based on everything in terms of helping them direct into what may be the benefits, limitations, risk in terms of their next step. For example, I'm in Virginia. There could be a clinical trial all the way in California, that involves taking a pill every day for 90 days and you're going to be monitored weekly, that may be something the family may want to do. In comparison, there may be a clinical trial at our own institution or an hour away that involves one visit, but it involves an injection inside the eye one time. How do you decide? Do you fly to California, do 90 days? Do you go an hour and get one single injection? And that's just an example. There are many different advantages, benefits, limitations, and each case is unique. And so that's why we really take our time to go over all this information, even before the family comes in for the visit. And then when they come in, we go over all this information with them. We give plenty of time for questions. And if they do decide to pursue, for example, a clinical trial, then we can help give the phone numbers, emails, contact information. We can help make those calls for the families to help facilitate that process as well. And then again, if there's no clinical trials or treatments, there's still like going over, what exactly does this mean for the family? Who else may be at risk? Who else may need to be tested? Who else does not need to be tested, for example? There's just a lot of information that we get back. And then, of course, the actual condition, what does that really mean? Are we talking about a condition that, your vision, it deteriorates, it reaches a plateau, and then you stabilize? Or are we talking about a condition that is continually progressive and majority of the patients end up blind? And they can be difficult conversations to have with patients and families. But in my experience, people want to know. People want to be able to prepare. They want to be able to take advantage of the those life opportunities when they still have vision, useful vision. They want to be able to take some opportunities if they need to learn Braille, or if they need to be seen by a low vision specialist to help maximize their environment. I've had high school students who they get diagnosed with a progressive condition, and they were still able to accomplish everything that they wanted to in terms of the trajectory in their life. They weren't going to change that, but some of them did make decisions in terms of what college they went to. With the college that was a little bit easier, more accessible to to get around in the particular city, or if they were close to their family and things like that. Those are all different decisions that can come out of these testing.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. And this is a great follow-up question, but what are some of the emotional and psychological concerns that individuals and families may experience when dealing with hereditary vision conditions, and how does genetic counseling support them through this?
Yeah, no, I'm glad that we segued into this. I mean, that is the counseling part of genetic counseling. We've talked a lot about the biology and the genetics of these conditions being caused by genes, being hereditary, running in families. The other part of it is living with the condition, but also coping with new information. We talked earlier about people taking 10 to 15 years to even get an answer, get a diagnosis. And part of our training is to actually be able to sit with parents, sit with families, and talk about it all, really unpack it from the very beginning and talk about how this information is going to be used in the family. How are we going to communicate as a parent to your child about what the progression of their condition may be? We have the skills and the tools and the language to be able to have those types of conversations. With adults, for example, we're very upfront about life planning decisions, whether that be about setting up certain insurances in place, vocational opportunities, family planning, for example. I mean, most studies show that for young adults going through a hereditary vision disorder or condition, the question about whether or not I'm going to pass this on to my kids is one of the biggest factors that they think about after they get their diagnosis. And part of our role as genetic counselors is to sit with them and understand where that question is coming from in the beginning, to make sure that they are aware of the actual odds of their condition being passed on. Sometimes, for example, in conditions that where it matters what sex or what gender you are, sometimes certain children that are born may not even be at risk. And so making sure that they've got accurate information about those odds are really important. And so we've talked about how long these appointments are. I think this is part of the reason that they are, is that we do actually dive into this opportunity, because that's what's unique about these particular group of conditions, is that hereditary nature. And there are professionals like me that are trained to try and address some of those concerns for families.
Wow, that's very helpful, because I was curious about that. Dr. Kauser, did you have anything to add about the psychological aspect?
I do. There's excellent points that Cameron brought up, and it's a great question, Shamika. These conditions are complex. This is not a put your quarter in the machine and the test pops back out and you have what you. I mean, these are why the visits take so long, and this is why the counseling aspect is very key and important for us to be able to understand when we get the results back. We've been talking about the advantages, and I often we are advocating for families to pursue genetic testing, but during the consent process, we give them any and everything, the good and the bad along with it. There's a reason why we don't test everybody, for example. When we're looking at certain eye conditions, the reason why a lot of these conditions are challenging to make without doing genetic testing is for several reasons. For example, there's something called variable expressivity, meaning that you could have two individuals, even from the same family, that inherit the same DNA change. We just call it mutation. Now we've sort of gone towards variant. So let's just call it mutation, so people kind of understand what we're talking about here. So they can inherit the same mutation or that variant change, and one person could be severely affected where they have progressive vision loss, they go blind. The other individual, again, even in the same family, inherit the same DNA change, could have a very milder version of that, where they still maintain useful vision. They may still be able to drive and still be able to do all the things that they want to do in life, where their sibling may not. There's also something called incomplete penetrance. That means that, again, same scenario. So say we're talking about two siblings in the same family. You could have both siblings inherit the exact same DNA change, same mutation or variant change, and one individual be affected and the other one be not affected at all. And those can be tricky sometimes too, when we're looking at family histories and we're trying to piece together, how this could or could not be running in the family. But that's one of those things that can be tricky. The other thing we're talking about eye conditions is that often, or sometimes I would say, when a patient comes to see me, we're looking at the retina, we're doing the dilated exam, we're looking at all these different things. The exam could be completely normal. That does not rule out that they have an underlying genetic eye condition. And particularly with the retina, there's some conditions, for example, that have very classic features. We were talking about retinitis pigmentosa. There's sometimes very classic features. You get these bone spicule areas of pigmentation. You can have these very narrow vessels inside the eye. You can get what's called a waxy pallor of your optic disc, which is the front part of the optic nerve that connects the eye and the brain. And it can be, you can look inside the eye and you can say, this patient has retinitis pigmentosa. But there are other conditions, you look inside the eye and the retina looks completely normal, but that patient could still have an underlying genetic eye condition. And so to kind of circle back what we're talking about, from the counseling standpoint, we typically, we as in, Cameron and I, genetic counselors, geneticists, we try to first test the affected family member. And often we try to test the most severely affected family member. And sometimes, we're unable to do that. It could be that, Aunt Sarah, who lives in Oregon, is the main person affected, but the patient that's in front of me, is unable to contact that individual, and they, so we may test the person that's in front of me having problems. But if there's a situation where the person may be completely unaffected, but their brother or sister or mom or dad had the condition, we may say, well, the best next step is to not actually test the person that's in front of me, and maybe to reach out to that family member to get them to come in to test them first. The other thing that comes up is testing what we call asymptomatic minors, meaning asymptomatic, meaning that no symptoms, minor, a child.
Mm-hmm.
And so say, for example, mom comes in, Cameron and I see mom, get a blood sample, send it off. 2 months later, result comes back as positive. Mom has a inherited retinal condition. Mom says, well, I have 3 kids. Can you test them all? I want to know if they have it or not. We try to steer families away from that. Again, we're talking about, I mentioned about incomplete penetrance. We could test one of those asymptomatic minors. That test could come back positive. We could be creating a lot of worry over nothing. Mm-hmm. That kid may never have any eye problems, but yet we're labeling them with a condition early on before they even had the power and ability to make that decision for themselves. Mm-hmm. And so we try to steer away from that. The other important point about this, again, talking about, and I don't want to call them negative, but just the sort of like the other side, because we did a lot of talking about the positives with genetic testing, but there are also situations, we're not situations, but we tell families that they are protected under law in certain circumstances through health insurance, employment, and even then there are some exceptions there, but they are protected. But there are things that are not protected if they will be labeled with a genetic condition. That's genetic eye condition or any genetic condition. For example, their rates for things like life insurance, short-term, long-term disability, things like that, there's a fair game for their premiums to be increased. They could be dropped from their plans, things like that. So it's not always an easy decision. Now, often, again, there are clinical trials out there, there are treatments out there. There's so many different things that we mentioned in terms of positive things, why you want to know. So more times than not, the benefits outweigh some of these limitations or risk or disadvantages or however you want to call it. Mm-hmm. But again, before we take that sample and send it off to that special laboratory, we're having a conversation with the family about all these different things. So they have a very, again, informed consent. I've mentioned that several times. So they know exactly what they're getting into even before we send out the sample.
Okay. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm going to get this last question in, so I don't want to take up too much of your time. Mr. Washington, how did you become interested in becoming a genetic counselor? Because there could be somebody out there that's wanting to follow that career path.
Well, I sure hope so, because there's not that many of us. So, I mean, right now there's about 6,000 genetic counselors that exist in the United States. 5% of them are men and 2% of them are Black. So I can count 10 people that I know of off the top of my hand that are Black male genetic counselors. There's probably 15. But if there's anybody in this audience that has an interest in genetics or is like me and is actually just a teacher who just so happens to be a genetic counselor, I really think that this could be a really awesome career field. We've talked about a lot of things that I think have drawn me to this. Number one, the genetics and the science. All of this stuff is extraordinarily cool and fascinating to me. It's one of those fields where we're still learning more. We know about 2% of our entire genome and how it works and what it codes for, but there's 98% of it that we're still just trying to figure out. So if you like to learn and you like to always learn something new, I really think this could be exciting for you. And then I didn't mention it, but one of the most satisfying parts of my job is exactly what we talked about on the results visits. When we have a positive result in front of us and we bring those families back either on the phone or in person, being the person to convey that information, to communicate it, to balance the information about here's what this disorder, this condition is going to mean for you or your family, but also here are the things that we can do. I find that being that person is just probably one of the most satisfying parts of my role. I'm a minority, and as we talked about, these conditions are rare, so I really get a lot of satisfaction kind of working with populations like this. So for all those reasons, become a genetic counselor, and I'll put my information, if I can, for people to contact me to figure out how you can do what Dr. Kauser and I do every day.
Dr. Kauser, how did you become interested in becoming a geneticist?
Yeah, that's a great question. And since we're getting close to close out, I do want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Stephanie Marino. I want to thank Donna Fishman. I want to thank Children's Vision Equity Alliance and Prevent Blindness for having this opportunity for Cameron and I to come speak on this topic. A large part of what I do is advocacy. And just like Cameron mentioned and you guys alluded to, you really need to see it to be it, right? It is hard to be a genetic counselor if you've never even seen a genetic counselor. And I think it's great that, we can be here too, so other individuals can, maybe be inspired to be a genetic counselor, be a geneticist, be an ophthalmologist, and hopefully they're able to see it. For my situation, I had a very interesting pathway. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. There were no doctors in my family. There weren't anybody who even graduated from college in my family. But my parents were very instrumental in getting me to go shadow people, go see people who had, been successful within this particular career path. And then this unique niche in medicine was very interesting for me. We talked about, I went to Howard University in DC, and I had a great experience there. Some of my mentors there, Dr. Copeland, Dr. Jones, Dr. Smith. I mean, these individuals really influenced me. And one of the opportunities we had when I was at Howard doing my ophthalmology residency was that we had the ability to do external rotations. And so I spent some time rotating at the National Institutes of Health when I was in residency. And when I was there, I happened to cross paths with an individual named Dr. Brian Brooks, who had trained in both ophthalmology and genetics and was running a genetic eye disease clinic. It piqued my interest. I knew I wanted to work with kids and their eyes, and so I didn't act on it right away. I ended up doing a pediatric ophthalmology fellowship after my residency. But when I was doing my pediatric ophthalmology fellowship, I crossed a path of another individual named Dr. Shankar, who did a very similar path Dr. Brooks had. She had trained in both ophthalmology and genetics. So it was the second time that I was able to see someone training in this. And it really inspired me yet again to go down this pathway. And so just to fast forward, I did some private practice for some years. There was a lot of overlap between pediatric ophthalmology and a lot of genetic conditions that we see. An opportunity opened up, I was able to go back and do a full genetics training program. And then I did that in North Carolina, and I came back to Richmond, and I started the first the ophthalmic genetic specialty clinic in the whole state of Virginia. I ran that for several years, as I was talking about, these conditions, and, a lot of practices with the rarity of these conditions, some ophthalmologists may see 1, 2, 3, a couple a year. I would see these patients almost every day. And I would see them at high volume. And I'm not the only one. There are not a lot, but there are individuals around the country that have decided to focus their practice on this particular patient population. So if any of you who are listening, patients or families, and you either yourself or your family are struggling with any of these things we mentioned, in particular those 7 things that I mentioned, there are experts out there. And like Cameron said, there aren't a lot of genetic counselors. We need more. We need more genetic counselors. We need more geneticists. We need more pediatric ophthalmologists. But there are there. You may have to travel depending on where you are, but talk to your primary care provider, your pediatrician, or your optometrist, or wherever you are, and for them to help facilitate the referral process, because that is really the key. Cameron and I can't do it alone. We can't go find every patient and then send them to ourselves and do the genetic testing and that type of thing. It really is a team effort. And we need everybody to be educated to at least, you might not be able to give me the 3 clinical findings and name me all the genes of retinitis pigmentosa, but you need to know that it exists. Because if you don't know that it exists, you will not be able to identify that patient, and it won't make sense to you if they're saying that they have night vision problems. If you don't know that there's a condition out there that has a genetic test that we can get an answer, then that is really what this advocacy effort for Cameron and I is really what it's all about. Obviously being there for patients and families, but really trying to educate the providers to know that these conditions exist, and so we all can be on the same team to get these patients where they need to go. Because there's a difference between a clinical diagnosis, which is essentially our best guess, and a molecular diagnosis, which is a definitive answer we get back from genetic testing. You cannot have a clinical diagnosis alone and get into some of these clinical trials, these treatments. You often have to go the full mile to get the molecular diagnosis, meaning that you have to have the genetic testing, get that answer back to proceed.
Thank you. I love both of your answers. If this has been such a great chat, because I still have 1,000 more questions, so you guys are going to have to come back. But thank you both for joining me on Seeing Eye to Eye and talking about inherited retinal diseases. For those of you watching, you can head over to blackdoctor.org for more articles on eye health. So thank you both, Dr. Kauser and Mr. Cameron Washington. I keep wanting to call everybody doctor.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us, Shamika, and great seeing you again, Cameron, as well.
You too.